So this is a Greg Weisman Gargoyles panel, which means I have prepared
absolutely nothing.
No, that's not true. This is bringing Gargoyles to the screen. This is, we used to call this the Rocky Horror Gargoyles show. Many of you have heard all this stuff before. In fact, many of you have heard all this stuff before many, many times. I assume there are some newbies here. Who's new and hasn't heard how this all happened? It seems impossible that there's anyone left on the planet how this all happens, but okay. Anytime.
I haven't heard.
Oh.
We're about to test the sound.
Test the sound.
So basically, just talking for the moment.
I'm going to keep talking for the moment. So, I'm about to tell you stories about how the journey Gargoyles took to get on the air. Some of these stories have punchlines, and some of you have heard the punchlines often enough that you can say them back to me, although it'll be interesting since it has been a long time for some of you, whether or not you're really going to be on top of things. So we'll see. I may have to correct you all.
Don't point our age up. I'm old.
Yeah, I'm a baby myself. Anyway, keep going?
Yes, to get him.
Sing us a
Okay.
song.
All right, here goes. So, gargoyles. I've been fascinated with gargoyles at least since I was a teenager. In high school, I took a trip to Europe. One of those trips that teenagers go on where they visit 8 countries in 5 weeks. Everywhere I went, I saw gargoyles, and I just was really interested in them. I collected postcards with gargoyles on them. I went up on Notre Dame Cathedral and would pose next to gargoyles in a gargoyle-esque pose. They just interested me, and I found it fascinating because I thought, well, there must be a lot of mythology and lore around gargoyles, and as it turned out, there wasn't. Now, I've learned that there's a little bit and more than I thought at the time since then, but initially all you sort of heard was, yeah, they were put up to scare away evil spirits. And I'm like, why would you think that putting up a monster would scare away something evil? And my brain extrapolates backwards as to what situation would cause that cultural phenomenon. But it's not like I was sitting there at age 16 going, I think I'm going to make an animated series about this in 14 years. It wasn't that at all. But I also spent a semester studying in Oxford, and Oxford is a great town for gargoyles, all sorts of weird gargoyles, including a Darth Vader gargoyle. And so again, I started taking pictures of gargoyles, again, without no particular end in mind. It was just some weird collection of postcards and photographs I had of gargoyles. And I went to Paris a couple times when I was there. I went to Scotland a couple times when I was living in Oxford. Went to London a lot. And everywhere I went, there were gargoyles, and I would take pictures and whatever. So, fast forward a decade or more, and I am now Director of Series Development at Walt Disney Television Animation. That's an executive position. I had started at Walt Disney as a junior executive, but what I really wanted to do was be a writer. And this was a way to pay the bills. I thought I would do this during the day, and then I would go home every night and write. So 5 years later, I'd written nothing of my own. I'd written all sorts of stuff for Disney, but I hadn't written anything of my own because I'd get home at night and, you know, be tired. And so we had this thing that I think some of you have heard of called the Disney Afternoon. And internally, we called that the Beast. And we had to keep feeding the beast. There needed to be a new show for the Disney Afternoon every new season. And the way the Disney Afternoon worked is you put a new show at the 4:30 slot, which was the premiere slot, and then you would move each of the other shows down a slot across our 2-hour block. The idea was we'd do just a few new episodes for the older shows. Sometimes contracts got in the way of that, but the plan initially was to do a few new episodes for each of the...
Testing. Thank you. Please stand by.
We're playing on you right now.
Should I push the play button or?
Yeah.
Dory, just like
There it is.
There it is.
The Erie building. Pretty cool, huh? Pyramids of Egypt, just like that. Anyway, I hope you're having a great time at the gathering, and I hope you enjoy these messages from...
There we go. You guys can hear it? Great. The answer is yes, and we're going to move.
Yeah, that's the next
Okay, great. Here, have a remote.
Thanks. This stuff is all for the next panel, but we needed to prep it. So, where was I?
feed the
I was
beast.
distracted by that handsome young man on the screen.
Feed the beast, everything slides down.
Right, yeah, so we were also developing shows for Saturday morning and for the networks. So the Disney Afternoon was a syndication block, but the networks also were clients of ours for shows like Winnie the Pooh and the Wuzzles and Gummy Bears and others. And sometimes we double sell. Darkwing was on ABC for a while also being in the Disney Afternoon, etc. So one show that we developed but didn't sell was based on a Roald Dahl book called about gremlins. And we developed a show. Roald Dahl wrote a book about gremlins during World War II, attacking planes, cute little gremlins attacking planes. Which was a legend during the war. And Dahl wrote a book about that, and we developed a series about that. And that one didn't sell. But the movie Gremlins, unrelated, was a big deal, and my boss was like, we need something like that. And that's when my Gargoyles obsession sort of raised its hoary head, and this is 1991. I wrote a very short, paragraph saying, let's do a show about gargoyles. And that was intriguing to my boss, and so my team and I got to work on that. And our initial development went through all sorts of stages, lots of little tiny variants, but the main version that we sort of brought forward was a comedy development, very much in the mode of Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears. So Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears was a show created by Jim Magon, who also co-created Tailspin. And this was a show with this rich backstory set in a medieval time period, great characters, very funny, but lots of cool, fun action as well. The sort of category we put it in was comedy adventure, so emphasis on comedy, but lots of adventure as well. A great villain in Duke Igthorn, who's very much in the Captain Hook tradition, at least the Disney version of Captain Hook. And a great sort of villainous sidekick in Toady, and then a couple of human friends, and we loved this show. But we also felt like it didn't get very much respect. It was completely original. But there was brand confusion between Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears and another show that was on the air at the same time called Care Bears. And it's easy to understand the brand confusion because both shows featured cuddly, small, teddy bear-esque bears, multicolored, but we thought Care Bears was just, and you do you. If you're a big Care Bears fan, more power to you. But we felt that Care Bears was this sort of saccharine, sweet show about hugs, and we thought there was much more to Gummy Bears, but we were the one named after a candy. And so we just thought it didn't get any respect, and so we very consciously set out, I very consciously set out, to do a show along the lines of Gummy Bears, but one that would gain more respect, that would gain more attention. And this was the 90s, and for those of you too young to know, the word edgy was really big in the days. Everything needed to be edgy. So we made a couple decisions about Gargoyles to make sure that it was edgier. One was we would have this rich medieval, well, one was just flat out, instead of cute little cuddly bears, multicolored bears, we'd have cute little multicolored gargoyles. Gargoyles are edgier than teddy bears. And then the second thing was that we would have this rich medieval backstory, just as Gummy Bears did, but we would put the gargoyles asleep for 1,000 years and have them wake up in modern-day Manhattan. So they'd be not running around the forests and castles of a medieval sort of nostalgia-driven Middle Ages, but they'd be in contemporary New York running around the skyscrapers, and that definitely seemed edgier, right? So we developed a cast of characters, and again, they went through many iterations, and if you go to AskGregWeisman.com and go to Ask Greg in the archives, the original development files, you can see a bunch of these iterations. I had some of you may remember Jordan Mann, who was part of the fandom in the late 90s. For a little while, Jordan was unemployed and was living in LA, and took it upon himself to, I had all these typed up documents, but they weren't, and I also had some handwritten documents from my old development file, but they weren't electronically filed, so he took it upon himself to transcribe a bunch of these, which I put up on Ask Greg, and then he got a job and didn't have time to do it anymore, so we never finished going through the development file. That file still exists, so at some point, my archivist will put the rest of those files up, I guess. The main iteration for the show had the leader of the gargoyles being a female gargoyle named Dakota, trying to ride herd over a bunch of wild, crazy little gargoyles. And Dakota wasn't that big either. These were all sort of smallish characters about the height of a gummy bear, right? Thank you. And the gargoyles that were in the group were Amp. And Amp was basically Brooklyn's personality in Lexington's body. And again, it's not even Lexington, it's an even cutesier version of Lexington, you know. And Amp was sort of the guy who thought he was a swashbuckler and an action hero and was always getting into trouble and going off without thinking kind of thing. And then we had a character named Lassie, and Lassie was basically a version of Lex, but in Brooklyn's body. And Lassie was sort of this idiot savant type, sort of brilliant with technology, in fact, but could also stand there and just watch a traffic light. Went from red to green. Oh, now it's yellow. It's red again. Green. I think it'll go red next. Nope, yellow. You know, there might be a pattern. And they all chose their own names, just like it ended up being in the show. And Lassie chose Lassie. Lassie was male, but Lassie chose Lassie because he had seen the dog Lassie on television and thought, that dog's really smart. I like that dog. So much slower, you know, when we ultimately did Lex with Tom playing Lex, you know, Lex is all energy and this kind of thing. Lassie was slower on the whole speech thing, but had that same sort of affinity to technology that Lex has. And then we had Coco. Coco was a female gargoyle, somewhat on the heavy side, who loved to dance. And then we had Ralph. So Coco was, loved to dance, but also loved to eat. So Coco was sort of the early version of Broadway, and Ralph was the early version of Hudson. Ralph was a gargoyle who, having discovered television and having discovered Barca Loungers, didn't really like adventure. He just, you guys go off, I'm fine here. And so he was a little bit older, but he was just fine staying at the castle. But the basic setup was exactly the same. Sorcerer casts a spell, they sleep for 1,000 years. There was a princess, they wake up. The castle has been moved above the clouds, and so they wake up 1,000 years later. The basic premise of the show was the same, but the tone obviously was very different. It was comedy adventure, like Gummy Bears. And so we pitched that show to Michael Eisner, I want to say in late '92, maybe early '93. And we thought it was great. And I think it was great. I mean, in other words, I think that would have been a really fun show for the Disney Empire. I am, in hindsight, very glad that Michael Eisner passed on that show. The show we ended up doing is one that's vastly more interesting to me, and I think has had the kind of life that brings people here 30 years later. But I do think that if the original version of Gargoyles had gotten on the air, it would have been beloved to a certain group of kids who grew up with it, and would go, oh, I remember Gargoyles. You know, not necessarily have the same passion for it that you people have for the show that did air, but I do think there would have been an easier road. You know, like DuckTales. There was a new DuckTales a couple of years ago. It would not surprise me if a new Gargoyles, you know, that kind of thing would have been a little more perennial and a little less, I don't know what to do with this show from a Disney standpoint. But it didn't go because Eisner didn't buy Gargoyles. But my boss, Gary Kreisel, felt there's something in this show. He said, work on it some more. And I looked at the show and I thought, well, I really like it. What are we doing wrong? So I pitched it to a handful of people at the studio, including Tad Stones, the creator of Chippendale's Rescue Rangers and Darkwing Duck, also one of the producers on Aladdin and Tad, we pitched the comedy adventure pitch to Tad, and Tad saw it, and Tad had worked at he was at TV animation, but previously had worked at feature animation, and so had buddies in feature animation. And Tad had seen an early animatic or work print like a reel of Beauty and the Beast. I hadn't seen it yet, but he had. And he said, you've got all these little gargoyles. What if you got rid of all the little gargoyles and just had one big gargoyle? And he pointed out that we had this female human in the modern era who was helping the gargoyles out. And this was a character who went through a bunch of different names, which included Morgan and Maria, a lot of names that we ended up using in the show because I try not to let anything go to waste, just like I eventually used Coco and Amp, but not Lassie. But it says Lassie a lot. But and so that female human in the comedy development also went through a bunch of different occupations. She was at times a firefighter. She was an archaeologist. She worked in a museum. Sometimes she was the mother of a couple kids who hung out with the gargoyles. Sometimes she was descended from the princess from the 10th century. We went through all sorts of iterations on her. But we ended up with her as a cop. And so to talk about that a little, we have to go back to another show called Bonkers. Now, Bonkers was a show that I developed and co-created. I don't think of myself as the creator of Bonkers the way I think of myself as the creator of Gargoyles, but it was a team effort, but I was part of that. And we developed a show with Bonkers, partnered with a female cop called Miranda Wright, and we made a bunch of episodes like that. And then some of the episodes came back from overseas, and the animation was, shall we say, subpar. And instead of the powers that be sort of going, we really need to deal with the subpar animation we were getting, they just freaked out about the show in general. And wound up firing the two producers on it, and hiring another guy who looked at the Miranda Wright character and said, well, here's your problem, women aren't funny. Traded Miranda for Piquel, who was a detective, not a cop, which threw off the whole dynamic for me. I came to hate the Piquel version of Bonkers. And we had made a bunch of episodes, and we even got most of the animation fixed on the ones that were bad. They're not perfect, but it's much better than what we were seeing initially. But they decided they would air the Piquel episodes first, and then create some weird transitional episode where Piquel joins the FBI and leaves town, and Bonkers becomes Miranda's partner. So even though the Miranda episodes were made first, they were aired second. And for a while, Gary, my boss, made me continue to supervise Bonkers, I think as a punishment. Like, you let this show get out of control, so you got to do that. And finally, there was a point where the producer of Bonkers, the new producer of Bonkers, and I were virtually, and I've been in one fist fight in my life. I got hit hard and fell immediately. But we were virtually on the point of physically attacking each other. There was so much animosity there. Gary, I swear to God, was amused by this. And the problem I had was that this man was considerably older than me. This was back when I was in my 20s. And he had to be in his mid-50s. Now that I'm 60, it doesn't seem that old, but at the time, he was much older than me. So the idea of fighting him physically didn't seem fair because he was a former Marine. And I was me. But it got that bad. I mean, we didn't actually ever hit each other, but there was a point, literally a meeting, where we both looked like we were about ready to get up in front of each other. And so finally, and again, Gary seemed amused by this. But finally I went to Gary and said, you gotta let me off the show. I can't do it. Because and I'll even admit to you, it's irrational. A lot of what they're doing is funny. It's all good stuff. But I am just so hostile to it. I'm not useful as an executive on the show. And so I was allowed not to supervise the Cal episodes. But what that did to me when it comes to Gargoyles, when it comes to Elisa, is that I was still mad about Miranda, who I thought was a great character, maybe not always executed fantastically, but I really did think she was a great character. She wasn't the funniest character in the show, but that also wasn't her role. She was the straight man. Bonkers was the comedian. So the whole notion just pissed me the fuck off. And so Elisa becoming a cop was, at least in some way, because I was like, we can do this. I know we can do this. I'm going to show that we can do this. But in any event, all that brings us back to Tad, who we had this female cop, adult, who was working with the gargoyles. She's like, get rid of all these Tad was like, get rid of all these little gargoyles and have one big gargoyle, and you can do a kind of Beauty and the Beast thing with the two of them. And that really clicked for me. Now, my background is not funny animals. My background is not crazy cartoons. My background, I worked at DC Comics for years. My background was superheroes, which is not what we were doing at Disney, and I was okay with that. But suddenly what I saw is this could be a superhero show. We weren't going to advertise it as a superhero show. There weren't going to be capes. There weren't going to be tights. There weren't going to be superpowers in the traditional sort of, he's the fast one, he's the strong one, you know, that kind of thing. But we could do that genre of storytelling. So superhero stories are a mutt genre that incorporates detective fiction and horror and sci-fi and fantasy, pretty much anything you can think of, because they had to put out 23 comic books a month, so they were just borrowing or stealing or homaging from everywhere. So everything became part of the superhero genre. I'm like, we can do that in a cohesive, coherent way with Gargoyles. So at that point, the artist Greg Buehler and I'd known Greg from my DC days, DC Comics days, and Greg at that time was just designing props at Walt Disney Television Animation. And he made great props, but I also knew what his talent was and thought he was being a little wasted, stuck doing pencils and lamps and stuff like that. And so Greg and I created Goliath. And by this time, Dakota, even before the comedy development was rejected, before we even pitched it to Eisner, Dakota, who was the female leader of the Gargoyles, the way the character seemed to develop, she just seemed dull. And so we changed Dakota to Demona, and we made her a villain, and suddenly she was very interesting. And we had a main villain, a human villain named Xavier, who was the rich guy who might have been descended from the sorcerer who cursed the gargoyles in the first place, or might not. We hadn't decided. We went back and forth on that a few times. I think we ended up in the comedy development saying that he was descended from them. And then Xavier had an assistant named Mr. Owen, and in the first episode, Mr. Owen is hit accidentally by a magic spell that transforms him into an anthropomorphic aardvark. He spends the entire rest of the series trying to convince magic users to turn him back into a human. And so we took all that, Amp and Ralph and Demona and Xavier and Owen, and we put that through the prism of Goliath. Came out the other end fundamentally with the show that you guys all know and I assume love, because why else would you be here? I said that to get you to clap so I'd have time to drink with us. And we fell in love with this idea. By this time I had 4 artists working on this show. Bob Klein, Dave Schwartz, Paul Felix, and Greg Buehler. I had a bunch of junior executives who worked under me working on this show. Fred Schaefer, Kat Fair, Cindy Shupak, Mike Ryan. My entire team jumped aboard Gargoyles. Paul Lacey, and we just started brainstorming all sorts of things, and we came up with the pack, and we came up with the mutates. The lead mutate back then was sort of a half Talon, half Savarius combo, which we later separated into 2 different characters, but called Cat Scan. I can't remember why, but I guess we thought that was a cool name or something. We had just all these ideas, Scarab, robotics, and all this stuff. At some point, because Marvel seemed interested in doing comic books, but Marvel didn't like that Xavier's name was Xavier because I guess they had their own Xavier character. We changed his name to Xanatos, which was a variation on the Greek god of death, Thanatos, but was in the phone book. So I'm like, all right, this is the name. Ultimately we named Goliath Goliath, and so we thought, well, we'll give Xanatos the first name David. That's a nice irony, you know. We went through all sorts of iterations on all the characters' names, finally deciding they would name themselves after landmarks in New York. And we had this big, huge pitch with all these ideas. Sometime in 1993, I went up in front of Michael Eisner, chairman of the Walt Disney Company, and pitched this great show to him, Gargoyles. And he passed. He didn't like it. He killed it. And I was sad. And the next day, we had what we called back then a post-mortem meeting. It was a meeting with myself, my immediate superior, a guy named Bruce Cranston, who was another big fan of the show, and my boss, our boss, Gary, and then Gary's boss, Jeffrey Katzenberg. So Michael Eisner was chairman of the whole Walt Disney Company. Jeffrey was chairman of the Walt Disney Studio. He was Michael's second in command, in essence. Now keep in mind, we would have these pitch meetings. I would pitch somewhere between 6 to 10 shows every 6 months to Michael Eisner. Gargoyles was just one of those. But Michael knew we had to feed the beast, the Disney afternoon. He had to pick something. Didn't have to he could reject 90% of what we did, but he still had to pick something. And I don't remember which year that was. I think it was the year he picked Goof Troop. So mostly this post-mortem meeting was to discuss what are the next steps on Goof Troop. That's what Michael picked. We've got to get it going, right? So we had this discussion, and then we're all standing up to leave, and Jeffrey says, oh, and you're going to keep working on Gargoyles, right? And I looked at him and I said, well, no. We pitched it as a comedy, Michael killed it. We pitched it as an action drama, Michael killed it. He killed it. And Jeffrey's like, oh no, Michael didn't kill it. He just thought it needed more work. So, you know, I stare across the table at Bruce for a second, and Gary, and vice versa, and it becomes clear to me in that moment that, I mean, Michael had killed it. I had been there. I'd done enough of those pitches to know when a show of mine had been killed. But what that told me was that Jeffrey liked it. Michael didn't like it, but Jeffrey liked it. And in those days, later, Michael and Jeffrey would go to war with each other, and Jeffrey would leave and co-found DreamWorks and everything like that. But in those days, they were still a team, but Michael was in charge and Jeffrey was the number 2 guy. So in the actual pitch meeting, Jeffrey wasn't about to sort of say, no, Michael, I think you're wrong. But on his own, he thought it still was a viable idea and thought there was something in it. I also found out later that Gary had in general been talking to Jeffrey about his concern that the Disney afternoon had the appearance of being too homogeneous. That though each of these shows, DuckTales, Gummy Bears, Tailspin, Darkwing Duck, Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers, Goof Troop, Bonkers, etc., were in many ways very, very different shows. Goof Troop is very much a sitcom gone batty, you know. Tailspin is an adventure show with comedy, etc. They were all very different shows, but it didn't change the fact that they all featured funny animals in the lead roles. And Gary's concern was that at some point the pendulum's going to shift and people are just going to get tired of even looking at funny animals, and that we needed to diversify the Disney afternoon. So one of the things that Gary also did was he had me develop with Bill Kopp and Jeff DeGrandis a show called Schnookums and Me. And so let's do some really, you know, Bob Clampett style or Ren and Stimpy style comedy that's really out there, as opposed to the story-driven comedy that we were mostly doing. But Gargoyles was also appealing because it was also a way to diversify the afternoon, and that was one of the reasons Jeffrey was behind it. But he also just liked it. So, all right, I went back to the drawing board a third time to try and figure out what do we do to change this show. And I sat down with my team and I said, after a lot of thought and a lot of discussion, I said, there's nothing wrong with this show, we're not changing the show. The problem's not the show, the problem is the pitch. We had thrown all these ideas, the pack, CAT scan, Scarab Corp, all this stuff into the pitch. It was distracting. One of the lessons that I've learned in development, and unfortunately have to learn over and over and over again because it never seems to sink in, is you get all these ideas and you want to tell people about them. Is less is more. The more you give them, the more reasons you potentially give them to say no. So we restructured the pitch. We cut out CAT scan, we cut out the pack, we cut out the mutates, we cut out all this stuff in order to focus the pitch on Goliath and Elisa and the Beauty and the Beast relationship. By this time the movie had come out, and as you may know, did fairly well. So I did we didn't add anything. We just removed. We reordered a few things, took cards away, and 6 months later went back and pitched it to Eisner a third time, and this time he bought it. And as the meeting was ending, Jeffrey stood up, looked at me and said, "You added a lot to that, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, I did." Because
I lied.
my mom didn't raise no fools. So you remembered one of the lines, but not the other line. 50-50.
Hey, it's been 15 years.
We're not sold on that second part.
Don't underestimate my power in this room. I can have you removed. All right, well now we had to make the show. And what sort of caught us off guard was that we didn't necessarily have the right people already at the studio to make that show, because it was so different. In fact, it was so different, there were a bunch of people at the studio going, "I don't think you should make that show." This doesn't seem appropriate to be made by Disney. You know, go take this somewhere else. Later we get, well, not even later. When we were making DuckTales, we got a letter from a mom somewhere in the country, I don't remember where now, but a letter who objected to us using the character of Magica Dispel in DuckTales, because magic is the work of Satan. And literally wrote, if Walt Disney knew this was happening, he'd be rolling over in his grave. And I wrote a letter back, which my boss didn't let me send, saying, "Have you seen Snow White?"
Downright angry.
So, but there were literally people in the studio who thought, not that part, but thought, this is too dark, this is too adult, we should not be making this show. And there didn't seem to be anyone who was a natural fit to do it. I went through, on the writing side, because my job was to find the writer-story editor for the show, I went through a number of very talented people who just didn't get it. And in fact, one who told me it can't be done here at Disney. And one who told me that this show has too much male energy and not enough female energy. And that was a guy, by the way, who said that. And so all sorts of people rejected it or tried to do it and didn't do a good job, didn't seem to get it. And I was really having trouble finding the right writer for this. I felt like I could do it, but that wasn't my job. My job was a development executive, and I don't think my boss would have let me do the writing on it anyway. And it just seemed to me like I was actually getting to the point where I'm going, well, maybe they're right. Maybe this doesn't work. I thought it did, but I wasn't sure, or at least I was starting to get insecure about the idea. We had a writer who did a version of the pilot that we had basically given him, and it wasn't working. And Paul Lacey and I basically then just blocked out the pilot ourselves. We just did it ourselves. Not the script, but the outline for it. And gave it to the writer, and he still couldn't do it. Meanwhile, on the art side of things, the executive on the production side of things, a guy named Tom Ruzicka, was also having trouble finding the right director-producer for the show. And we all of us, Bruce, Gary, myself, my team, we all believed in the show, and yet somehow we couldn't seem to find the right creative staff to do it until we started rating the staff of Batman the Animated Series. So I found Michael Reeves, and Michael got it, and he took the version that Paul and I had written the plot for of the pilot, which a writer named Eric Luke had attempted to do and had not nailed it for us. Eric shares credit with Michael on the pilot because of that sort of technicality. Michael wrote the script, Paul and I wrote the outline. Paul and I were executives, so we get zero credit for that. But I don't want to underplay Michael's contribution to it. Michael solved it. We came up with the storyline, and Eric shares credit because of that technicality that he wrote a version of it first that didn't work. Michael is the one who wrote the script that worked, and he's the guy who nailed it and finally proved to us that it could work. The show would not be the show you know and love without Michael Reeves. So Michael was hired as the story editor, but we didn't have a producer. Because Tom could not find a producer. But we had deadlines, so someone had to start making decisions that normally would be the decisions that the producer would make. So those fell to me. And so I wound up, I had worked on this is mid to late 1993. And I'd been working on this project since 1991, and I'd been in love with the idea of doing something with Gargoyles for a decade earlier than that. And so I continued to get more and more invested in this show. And ultimately, Tom Ruzicka, who was the production executive, rated Batman the Animated Series and found Frank Paul, who was a director on Batman working for Bruce Timm. But by the time he did that, I was so deep in, not just the creation of the show and the development of the show and the sale of the show, but also now at this point the production of the show, that I went to Gary and Bruce and I said, I want to produce this show with Frank. And they said to me, well, Greg, you never produced a show before. What makes you think you can do this? And I said, well, 5 years ago, I've never been a development executive before, and that worked out okay. And they said, well, we got to think about this. And so they went off and came back and said, okay, you and Frank, you can produce the show with Frank. You two will be the co-showrunners. But you have to keep your current job because, we don't want to give up that slot. Basically what they were saying is, we don't think you're going to be any good at this, but we do think you're good at your current job, so we don't want you to give up the current job because you're going to fail at this new job. It's not the way they worded it, but it was definitely the message they were giving. And so you're going to have to do 2 full-time jobs for the next 10 months at the salary of the lesser of the 2. So that's what I did. Money wasn't really the issue for me. The fact that I was working 2 extremely difficult full-time jobs simultaneously and not sleeping much, not that that's changed, was more of an issue, but we did it. We produced the show. We did 13 episodes on a 10-month sliding schedule. And it was a huge hit. Huge. Now, before that, we premiered on September 29th, 1994, at Pleasure Island at Disney World. In those days, Disney World had a multiplex on Pleasure Island. And they had a big event at Disney World, not for us, but for the opening of the Tower of Terror. But they thought, again, synergy is not a big word with Disney right now, but back then, synergy was big, and they thought, Tower of Terror, Gargoyles, that's a good match. And so they had us make a movie version of the 5-episode pilot. And because we were doing this simultaneously, that meant that Frank took charge of the 5-episode version, and I took charge of the movie version. And they were two separate post-production things, so the cuts are slightly different. It's not as simple as just removing the commercials and shoving them together, because the movie had to play tighter. So we had to take all this material out, and then there were little minor choices that I made differently from what Frank made, and we mixed them separately because they were two different lengths. Frank's version was mixed at where we mixed all the rest of our shows at Advantage Audio. My version was mixed on the Disney lot at the main mix studio there. That's where I kept hearing Goliath said backwards as Thalog and got the idea for Thalog. So we produced this movie. Oh my God, I skipped a bunch of stuff, didn't I? See, it's been too long. Well, let me tell this story, then I'll backtrack. So we produced this movie, and we take it to Pleasure Island. Keith David's there, and Marina Sirtis is there, and Sally Richardson is there, and my boss Gary Kreisel is there, and all these Disney executives are there, and they have it showing on 2 screens at Pleasure Island. And one screen is reporters, all these reporters, and then to fill out the audience, they got local kids brought in on buses and they're allowed to see this for free at Pleasure Island. And then the other screening was all kids. And then they did something genius. They gave every kid a free jumbo popcorn and a free soda. What that meant is the kids are eating the popcorn, which is salty, and so they keep drinking the soda, which means they have to go to the bathroom with their damn little bladders. So they are constantly getting up in the middle of the movie to go to the bathroom, coming back, crawling over each other. And so in my theater, because Gary said, as we were going, he said, okay, I'm going to go into this theater, you go to the other one, I'll take Keith, Sally, and Marina with me, you go alone in the other one. I'm like, wait, what? That one of the actors? I mean, and he's like, no, you don't need that. The actors are for the reporters. The kids won't care who the voice actors are. I'm like, well, they're not going to care who I am. And he's like, just introduce the movie and let it run. It's fine. And coincidentally, Bob Schooley, one of the co-creators of Kim Possible, happened to be at Disney World on a family vacation. So I called him up and I said, can you come to this movie for moral support? So I'm sitting next to Bob in this film, and let me tell you, in my theater, it is a disaster. Because the kids keep getting up to go to the bathroom. They're not focused, they're not paying attention, no one laughs at any of the jokes, there's no gasps at any of the exciting moment. It is, and when it ends, it's dead. There's no applause, there's no nothing. It is just dead. And they all just sort of get up to go. And okay, there's a press conference in the other theater that I have to go be part of. And I say that to Bob, and Bob's like, yeah, I'm gonna go back to my family now. Good luck. And I am crossing from one theater to the other like dead man walking. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this doesn't work. And I get to the other theater, and Rich Frank, who is Gary's boss, my boss's boss, you know, I know I said Jeffrey was Gary's boss, but that Rich was actually in between Jeffrey and Gary. So Rich Frank comes up to me and he goes, oh my God, and I'm like, I know, I'm about to say I'm sorry. And he goes, that was amazing! Great job, great job! What? It's like, oh my God, they laughed in all the right places. When this action happened, the whole theater gasped out loud. I could not have gone better. How'd it go in your theater? Well, pretty much like that, yeah. And Laura Whitcomb, who was our publicist, came up and said, this is fantastic. It's so good. It couldn't be any better. And I'm like, great. And so, you know, we get up on stage. It's me and Gary and Keith and Keith David and Maria Sirtis and Sally Richardson. 5 of us up on the stage. And you can tell there is tons of enthusiasm coming over there, and I am trying to recalibrate as rapidly as I can, and also hide the fact that it had been a disaster in the other theater where there had only been kids. So I guess because the adults were around, the kids were better behaved in this theater, because there were some kids in this theater. They weren't still there for the press conference, they all left with the buses for the other kids. So they weren't there to sort of say, well, I really liked it, but my friend in the other theater thought it sucked. So there were no kids left in the theater when we were doing the press conference. And a guy, a reporter, male reporter, raises his hand and says, you know, I really enjoyed that, but, you know, do you think this is this going to be the thing that, for kids, you know? And we start talking about, yeah, you know, it's good for kids, you know, it's, don't judge a book by its cover, you know, yeah, they look like scary monsters, but they're actually the heroes. And then a female reporter raised her hand, and she's like looking at Keith. Going, oh, because someone had said, I think even Keith had said with Keith's voice, you know, yeah, they look like ugly monsters. I'm not going to try to do Keith's voice. They look like ugly monsters, but really they're the heroes. And she said, I didn't think Goliath was ugly at all. There wasn't applause, but the laughter and everyone, you know, this big tension release happened. It was great. So that went great, and then we all went and rode Tower of Terror. And actually had a really great weekend, and, you know, I called Beth, my wife, and she's like, how'd it go? I said, it was weird. check really quick. What is, I know, because I'm just bleeding into the next panel, but what is the next panel? Okay, so I've got a half hour. That's good. If you need to leave, in theory the panel's over, but we're just starting the next panel at 2, where I'm going to show a bunch of videos. So, and when I say videos, sometimes I literally mean videos. So the story I skipped, I can't believe I skipped it. I just haven't done this in 6 years. Last time I did this spiel was in 2018 at CONvergence at the old hotel.
And then it's the closing ceremony.
And I'm definitely rusty, but in any event, we had a press event. This is long before we actually had a finished movie. We just had a little bit of footage back from overseas, which we cut together into a promo. We didn't have any music yet, so we stole music from promo from 2 movies, from Glory and from The Power of One. And we did this at the Universal Sheraton, right? Yeah. And it's just like a 2-minute, less than 2-minute promo. And we had all this press there, and me and Gary again, but a different group of actors. This was Jonathan Frakes, Bill Fagerbacke, and Ed Asner, who from a television standpoint were in some ways a more prominent group than Keith and Sally, at least in those days. Because Bill was a regular on Coach, Ed Asner was Ed fucking Asner, and Jonathan Frakes was a regular on Star Trek The Next Generation. So we had, the 5 of us, we played this promo on a screen much bigger than this, but in a room not dissimilar to this one, and 2 giant speakers. And I just said to the guy before we started, I said, you crank that volume all the way up. And it plays, and when it's over, silence. Not silence like the kids in the movie theater who are like, yeah, whatever. This was like, holy shit, silence. But not necessarily holy shit, great. And not even necessarily holy shit, awful. It was like, what the fuck is this? Just watch.
Holy shit, curiosity.
And so we get a question from the audience, which was a common question we got in those days, because this was nothing like anything Disney TV animation had ever produced before. And they're like, would you show this to your kids? So, Jonathan and I, our wives were both, Jeannie Francis, Jonathan's wife, and my wife Beth, were both pregnant, but I think most of you met or at least got to hear Aaron speak,
Yes.
daughter Aaron. My wife was pregnant with Aaron. That's my oldest of my 2, so I didn't have kids yet. I mean, technically I did, but I didn't. Same with Jonathan. Ed Asner's kids were my age. And Gary's kids were teenagers. So the questions just sort of got passed down the line to Bill Fagerbacke, who was the only one of us who had young children at that time. And Bill sort of pauses, and then before he answers, and then he goes, well, it's better than Barney! He goes, well, it's better than Barney! And any reporter in the audience who had kids, and I didn't really get it yet, but I would shortly, had watched a lot of Barney. Really hated that show. And so I got a big laugh, and everyone relaxed. And from that moment on, press was always great to us. They loved the show. They realized it was something different for the Disney afternoon, and instead of attacking it for that reason, they hailed it for that reason. They embraced it. That led into then the premiere a few months later, and then about a month after that, in October of 1994, the show premiered. And it, as I said, it was a grand slam home run in the ratings. You know, we were a weekly show. We were on the first week. They took the 5-part pilot and ran it across the 4:30 slot of the Disney afternoon, which differed in different cities because it was syndication, but still was sort of whatever the best slot was. That's what we got that week. And then after that, we were once a week on Fridays until we got the footage back on Enter Macbeth, and it was a complete disaster. It had been subcontracted out, and it was a huge mess. And we showed it to our bosses. Frank and I showed it to Gary, and we just said, we can't put this on the air. And he said, fine, just air the next one. I said, we can't do that either, because this is the episode where they move from the castle to the clock tower. It's not going to make any sense. He said, wait, you created a situation where we can't put the episodes in any order? And I said, is that a problem? That was a problem! It was right for the show, but it was a problem. So they had to run reruns. But what that meant was they wanted to run the oldest possible show. They didn't want to run the one from last week or the week before, so they ran the first part of the 5-part pilot. Well, if you do that, then you got, we didn't need 5 weeks to fix this problem. We needed 2 weeks. But you know, you start the 5-part pilot, you're airing the entire 5-part pilot. So that gave us a hit in the ratings because, you know, really soon after we had started, we were back into reruns for 5 weeks. But then we came back with new episodes and the ratings went back up. We were Kenner's number, despite the fact that they never used the goddamn helicopter. we were not just Kenner's #1 selling toy, we were the best-selling boys action toy in America that year. We were a huge hit. And everyone was happy. Especially happy was Buena Vista Television, which was the distribution arm of the Disney Company and the distributor of the Disney Afternoon and Gargoyles, including Gargoyles. So now Gary pretty quickly, because we were doing so well, gave us a pickup for 6 scripts, not to make 6 episodes, but he figured we'll order 6 scripts, that'll give us a bit of a head start. And worst comes to worst, if we don't get a pickup, the cost of making 6 scripts, he was willing to eat that cost. He didn't think he'd have to, and of course he didn't end up eating that cost. But he was willing to take that risk just on the script, 6 of them. So we got called in by Buena Vista Television. I'm there with Gary and Bruce. And keep in mind, I'm still an executive. I produced the show with Frank. My credit was all over the place. They decided that since Frank had done post-production on the original 5-part pilot on his without me, because I was working on the movie version, that I shouldn't have a credit on the first 5 episodes. Because executives are not supposed to have credits. Then they gave me a co-producer credit, and then finally we both became producers. But the truth is, from day one, we were the co-showrunners of the thing. And I didn't get a creative writer credit because Disney didn't give those out. You don't see a Darkwing Duck created by Ted Stones. You don't see Gummy Bears created by Jim Magon. You don't see Tailspin created by Jim Magon and Mark Zaslav. There are no created by credits. And I'm bitching about this now, because every once in a while you see on the internet someone saying, Greg Weisman did not create Gargoyles. He's stealing credit from Michael Reeves, who's dead and can't defend himself. Now, this is offensive to me on so many levels, I can't even tell you. But Michael appeared, you guys remember, at 2 of our conventions, 2 of the gatherings. There was never a moment when Michael said, Greg Weisman is trying to steal credit from me. Michael was essential to the production, but he came onto a show, as did Frank, that already had been developed and sold. It was fundamentally the show that went on the air. And again, pilot 5-parter plot, the outline, not the script. Michael did the script, but the outline was written by Paul Lacey and myself. And so it does grind on me when I see that. But let's move on, because everything's fine.
I will say this, Mallory Reeves didn't mention that in Voices from the Erie. She was very friendly with you.
Yes, Mallory and I get along great. No, there's no one who actually worked on the show who has any doubts about this fact, that somehow there's some experts on the internet who know I'm a credit stealing, whatever. Anyway, let's move on.
Good idea.
So we get in with Buena Vista, and they're really happy with the show, and so they say to us, okay, for the next season, it's been a weekly show. Next season we want it to be a daily show, which means we need 65 episodes. You made 13, we need 52. I'm like, for what season? They're like, for next season. I'm like, but next season is 6 months away. Is that a problem? That's not a problem, that's literally impossible. You're giving me a 10-month sliding schedule like you did last season. But last season we did 13 episodes. Now you want 52 in 10 months. Well, we want them all in the fall quarter. Oh, so less than 10 months. Right. Cannot be done. Well, just, hire more crew. I'm like, it doesn't matter how many crew members I hire. It cannot be done. There's just no way to do it. And they're like, well, what do you think you can do? I said, well, I know we can do 6 because we've got 6 scripts already in the works. And we did 13 last year, so I think we can do 13 this year. There's no reason why we can't do 13. And because we have the 6 script advantage, I think if we really push and kill ourselves, I think we could make it to 18. I said, we can do more than that, but if you're talking about the fall quarter, I think we top out at 18. Do you want 18? Well, no. If you can't do 52, then screw it, just do the 6. And I was pretty bummed. I wasn't bummed that I wasn't going to get makes 52. That was insane. But I was hoping for another pickup of 13. And the fact that they sort of, had a tantrum and said, just make 6. It's kind of a bummer, but okay, we weren't dead. We would make 6. 2 weeks later, I get a call from the head of Buena Vista Television. He said, hey, you guys said you could make 13. We want 13. I said, that was 2 weeks ago. It cost us 2 weeks on the schedule. He's like, 2 weeks. You said you could do 13. You said you could do 18. We want 13. I'm like, all right, yeah, all right, we can do 13. I think we can do 13. Not a problem. 2 weeks later, I get a call from the head of Buena Vista. You guys said you could do 18. We want 18. I said, that was a month ago. You cost me a month of my schedule. We don't have to stay. You said you could do 18. We need 18 in the fall quarter, you're doing 18. Okay. 2 weeks later, I get a call from the head of Buena Vista Television. You're doing 52. I said, Mort, 6 weeks ago I told you I couldn't do 52. What makes you think with less time I can now do 52? He's like, we need 52. It shows a huge hit. The Disney Afternoon needs it. We need 52. It's not optional. You're doing 52. All right, so the first thing I did was go to my bosses and said, I can't do my development job and produce 52 episodes simultaneously. So I gave up the development job and became a full-time producer. Second thing we did is we expanded the team. We went from 1 story editor, Michael Reeves, to 4 story editors, Michael Reeves, Bryn Chandler Reeves, Gary Bates, and Gary Squirrel. We went from 1 direction team in Japan. Japan kept going, but we created 3 teams in LA. 1 headed by Frank himself, and then 1 headed by Dennis Woodyard, and 1 headed up by Bob Klein, directing and producing. And we decided we needed to expand the world, which brought us to all sorts of things, you know, some of which we had always planned to do. Again, the mutates and everything. They had gone through some changes from the CAT scan days, but still, you know, we had always planned to bring that back into the show. But we did the world tour, we did Oberon's Children, we did all this stuff, we showed other plans, and then during this process, I'm in a meeting with, again, all the executives. We have these meetings with Michael Eisner every 6 months. And one of the things that happen at those meetings is that I introduce a whole bunch of shows. But other stuff also happened because these were corporate meetings. It wasn't just a TV animation meeting. This was the whole, they called them retreats. And the first time we went down to the La Quinta in Palm Springs to have it. But then at some point they're like, why are we spending all this money? Just do it here. So they still called it a retreat every 6 months, even though we were just doing it in a building with the dwarves on it. Which I guess they thought was special because at the time it was new. And so I'm in this meeting and Michael says, I want to buy Marvel Comics. This is in 1995, I want to say. Yeah. And a whole bunch of other executives stood up and said, no, 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 you don't want to do that. And he's like, yeah, we can get it cheap. They're in bankruptcy. It's perfect. Let's buy it. Let's, you know. And they're like, no, it's a mess. The whole thing's a mess. You want to do it because you want to make a Spider-Man movie, but Marvel has double sold the rights to Sony and to this company and to Golden Globus and all this sort of stuff. You won't even be able to make the movies you want to make. You know, you'll have to make movies with lesser characters like, I don't know, Iron Man or something. You don't want it. And they, before my eye, I'd been very excited for about 12 seconds. And then before my eyes, they talked him out of it. And he said, well, we need something to compete with Warner Brothers, who has Superman and Batman. And he looked at me and he said, can we turn Gargoyles into an action franchise? And I said, we can. He said, okay, go do that. So among the things we did in the second season, we did all these backdoor pilots for the New Olympians, for Pendragon. We created pitches for a prequel series, Dark Ages. We created sequel series. At the time it was Gargoyles 2158. I later did some math and realized that that was a dumb idea. And made it 2198, but at the time it was 2158. And Time Dancer, we had all these ideas and we were going to do all this stuff. And then Frank Wells, who was the #2 guy at Disney, so not on the chain from Michael to Jeffrey. Frank was sort of the business guy to Michael's creator guy. Frank Wells died in a helicopter accident. And everything at Disney fell apart. Without Frank there to balance Michael out, Michael died even. Michael was sort of the last of the Hollywood moguls. And he went to war with Roy Disney, Walt's nephew. And Roy didn't like that Michael was appearing on television with a toupee, in essence, taking credit for the Walt Disney Company. I mean, he ran the Walt Disney Company, it didn't seem that outrageous, but he felt like it was one thing for Walt himself to go on, Disney Sunday night, but for Michael to do that, who are you? You're an executive. You're not at Disney. You shouldn't be doing that. And he didn't like that. And there was a lot of objection to what they called Michael's micromanaging, which at the time I understood, but what I didn't realize was the plus side of Michael's micromanaging. Michael was the guy who chose every show we made. We had to pitch to him. And at the time, I didn't realize that what upset me back then was that there were all these great show ideas that Michael killed. But when Michael said yes to a show, everyone got on board or got out of the way. And that was a phenomenal benefit to the shows that he approved. And when Michael was accused by his board of being a micromanager, he gave up very little. But one of the things I hope he reluctantly gave up was choosing the shows himself. But he didn't empower another individual to make those choices. It became a decision by committee. And that was a huge nightmare. And that has become the rule at every studio. No one person has green light power, that you need to get 8 people all simultaneously to say yes at the same time. When Frank died, Jeffrey felt that he should get the #2 position, and no one seemed at Disney to like that idea. Roy didn't like it because he thought, just as he thought Michael was taking credit for the company's success, he didn't like how Jeffrey seemed to be taking credit for feature animation success. And Michael didn't even like it either. Thought Jeffrey was getting too big for his coaches, so they go to war. Jeffrey ends up leaving and forming DreamWorks. The whole situation is so unpleasant that Rich Frank leaves, Gary leaves, Bruce leaves. Eisner has put himself out of reach, and then ultimately even he leaves. So I had all these executives who were huge fans of the show leave within a 12-month period, all of them. And the people who came in had no investment in the show. And so they looked at the ratings for season 2. And we had 2 big problems. No, 3. In season 2. Now we were still a hit, but we had been a grand slam home run in season 1. In season 2, we were a single. Maybe a double sometimes, but mostly a single. And there were 3 reasons for that. One reason was Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which premiered and kicked our ass day in, day out in the ratings. We were always #2 to them. We were strong #2, we were never #3, but we were also never #1. It's not like they had an off week and sometimes we climbed to #1. We were never #1. They beat us week in, week out, day in, day out. The second problem was they wanted 52 episodes in the fall quarter. I told them it couldn't happen. I was right. Now, we did 31 episodes in the fall quarter. Remember, I thought we could only do 18. We did 31, which I was pretty damn impressed with, and they were pretty damn upset about. Among the things problems that caused was, of course, okay, there are going to be a lot of reruns because you don't have 52 episodes straight to play from September to December with no interruption. So there's a bunch of reruns. Another problem that caused is that we had scheduled this world tour for our characters. A world tour that, if you count the number of episodes, of 5 episodes a week, would have lasted a few weeks. And which instead lasted months and months and months because we had all these reruns because we didn't have all the episodes done in time.
Real time.
Right, so they're like, and the fans didn't love it, for the most part. So that was a problem. And then there was the O.J. Simpson trial. Keep in mind, we were on syndicated stations across the nation. Most of the money for independent stations comes from their local news. We were preempted all the time for the O.J. Simpson trial, or for coverage of the O.J. Simpson trial, for the white Bronco chase, slow chase, for if gloves don't fit, you can't convict, or whatever. You must acquit, that's it, right. Everything about the O.J. Simpson trial was grounds for local stations to preempt us, so that sometimes even our new episodes were glimpsed. And like I said, we were never a failure, but from the point of view of Buena Vista Television, they're like, well, this show just doesn't work. There was no memory that we had told them that they couldn't have 52. They're like, you said you could do 52. I said, I never said that. I said the exact opposite of that. We gave you 31. I said the most we could do is 18. They're like, you said you could do 52. You said we had to do 52, and you didn't do it. Also, I was no longer an executive, but while Gary was still there, I still went to the Tuesday morning meeting and called the executives, so I was very much in on what was going on in the studio. Once Gary left and Dean Valentine came in as the new boss, I was no longer allowed to go to those meetings. Then Gary and Bruce went to join DreamWorks, and everyone in the upper management at Disney TV Animation became convinced that my plan was to follow them as soon as Gargoyles was over. And so they began to treat me like I was a spy in their base. So we had, by that time, developed a pitch for New Olympians and all sorts of stuff, but we had pitched Dark Ages to CBS for their Saturday morning. They didn't like it, but they expressed a real interest. They said, we don't really want to do a prequel, but we like that sequel idea. Come back to us with Gargoyles 2158. And meanwhile, Gary had really liked one of his last things he did before he left. He really liked the Bad Guys pitch, so he had us work up a sort of mini episode of that with an animatic and voice work and storyboards and music and all that kind of thing. But the new regime didn't care for it, any of this. Weren't interested in Gargoyles being the basis of a new action universe that Michael had wanted. And so everything just began shutting down for us. On Bad Guys, at one point, a couple of executives came into my office just as we were finishing up Bad Guys, the reel for bad guys. And they said, hey, we wanted to pick your brain on something. I said, sure, what? They're like, who do you think would be a good showrunner for bad guys? I said, what are you talking about? Like, well, who do you think would be good to be the showrunner, sort of like the you for bad guys? And I'm like, what do you mean? Me! I mean, I practically got up on the table, stood up on my desk and said, what the fuck are you talking about? I created the show, it's a spin-off of my show. Me! And they're like, oh, we didn't think you'd want it. I'm like, why would you think that? Well, this is kind of a action show, and you're kind of the gothic action guy. That's a quote. Some of the stuff I've been saying I approximate, maybe even exaggerate, but that is a quote. You're kind of the gothic action guy. I'm like, how slim are you slicing this pie? Gargoyles has all this humor in it, you think I can't write comedy. Now it's not just I'm an action guy, I'm a gothic action guy. And I was so outraged that they were like, okay, yeah, you're the guy. 5 days later, they killed it. They killed it when all we had left to do was the mix, the sound mix. That probably would have cost them a couple grand. I went to Advantage Audio, who again I'd had a long relationship with, and I said, I need to do the sound mix because I need to finish this. We're just too close for me not to do it. I mean, they killed the 2158 pitch. Fine. I mean, we hadn't gotten anywhere on that. They killed New Olympians. We had the pitch, but we hadn't done anything with it. But I'm like, we're one step away from completion. I've got to finish this thing. Advantage charged me $200. I paid out of my own pocket. Now, again, Disney wouldn't have gotten it for $200. At most, it would have been $3 or $4 grand, but my guess is it would have been $2. And $2 grand is a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
And I was saying to them initially, I'm like, how can you not finish this? You know, we're so close. And then you can look at it and decide. And they're like, we've decided, we don't do it. It's not part of our plan. So I finished it myself. And then Frank and I finished post on Gargoyles. Frank left to go to DreamWorks. And then my contract was up at the end of Gargoyles. And again, I thought I would be at Disney my whole career. That was my plan. They weren't offering me anything. Well, I didn't know anyone in the business except people at Disney and people at DreamWorks who had just gotten there from Disney. I knew one guy at Warner Brothers, Alan Burnett, because he had been at Disney when we did DuckTales the movie. And I'd worked with him on that a little bit. And so we talked a little, but he wasn't really in a position to hire me. I think he put in a good word for me there, but no one knew me at Warner Brothers. So I wound up going to DreamWorks. So 4 days before my last day at Disney, the executive who had replaced me as director of series development called me up and said, hey, you want to grab lunch tomorrow? I'm like, sure. So we went out to lunch. Keep in mind now it's 3 days, because it was the next day, so 3 days before my last day at Disney. He goes, hey, is there any way we could keep you? And I said, you're asking me that now? He's like, yeah. I'm like, no. I've been dying for you guys to make me an offer. You didn't, so I accepted an offer at DreamWorks. Find out later, he goes back to the executive meeting, he says, we were right. He was always going to go to DreamWorks. This is why none of you should wish for a career in Hollywood. In any event, that all sounds bad, and it kind of was. But the fact of the matter is that Gargoyles was one of the great moments and continues to be one of the great moments in my life. I've got a bunch of things to show you that I think you'll find fun. Most of you have seen most of it before, but a few of you have.